Hello, English learners. Welcome back to Talk English Now. I'm Sarah, and today we're going to talk about some of the most advanced and powerful English vocabulary that you can add to your speech to sound clear, confident, and highly fluent. This lesson is designed especially for learners aiming for advanced fluency, the kind of level we often describe as C2. At this level, it's not just about knowing words. It's about using words in precise, natural, and powerful ways. So today, I'll introduce you to over 125 vocabulary words that are widely used in advanced English. I'll not only say the word, but also explain its meaning in a natural way, and then give you examples so you can really hear and practice how it flows in real sentences. Let's start slowly and clearly, and I encourage you to repeat after me whenever you feel ready. Repetition and shadowing are powerful tools for making these words part of your active vocabulary. Our first word today is ephemeral. Ephemeral means something that lasts for a very short time. Imagine the beauty of a rainbow after the rain. It is ephemeral, disappearing within minutes. You can say, her happiness was ephemeral, fading quickly after the news. This word carries a poetic sense, and advanced speakers often use it to express the fleeting nature of experiences. Next, let's explore the word ubiquitous. Ubiquitous means something that seems to be everywhere at the same time. For example, smartphones are ubiquitous in modern society. This word makes your English sound sharp and academic, but also very natural in daily advanced conversations. Another powerful word is quintessential. This means the perfect example of something. For instance, Shakespeare is the quintessential English playwright. You might also hear, she is the quintessential leader, Cal, and inspiring in every situation. Let's pause and breathe with the word serendipity. This word describes the happy chance of finding something good without looking for it. For example, meeting my old friend in the library was pure serendipity. This word has a warm and positive feeling, and it often appears in both literature and everyday conversation. Now, let's look at magnanimous. It describes someone who is generous and forgiving even when they have power over others. Imagine someone who loses a competition gracefully and congratulates the winner. That person is magnanimous. You can say, he was magnanimous in victory, praising his opponent's effort. Another strong word is resilient. Resilient describes a person who can quickly recover from difficulties. For example, children are often resilient after setbacks. You can also use it for materials like rubber is resilient because it can return to its shape after being stretched. Let's continue with meticulous. It describes someone who pays attention to the smallest details. You can say, she is meticulous in her work, checking every number twice. This word communicates precision and carefulness, and it makes your language sound professional. Now listen to eloquent. An eloquent person speaks in a way that is clear, persuasive, and moving. For example, the teacher gave an eloquent speech that inspired the students. You can practice by saying, He is eloquent in expressing his ideas. Our next word is altruistic. This means showing a selfless concern for the well-being of others. For example, her altruistic nature led her to volunteer every weekend. This word is often used when talking about kindness that is pure and without selfish motives. Let's add tenacious to your vocabulary. A tenacious person never gives up easily. You can say, "She was tenacious in pursuing her goals." It is a powerful compliment when used positively, and it describes strong determination. Here is a beautiful one, cathartic. Something cathartic provides emotional release, like crying after a sad movie. For example, writing in her journal was cathartic, helping her release stress. This word is common in psychology and literature, but it's useful in everyday speech too. Another advanced word is idiosyncrasy. This means a peculiar or unique behavior or feature of a person. For example, one of his idiosyncrasies is humming while working. It shows that everyone has small, unique habits. Let's try lucid. Lucid means clear and easy to understand. For example, she gave a lucid explanation of the problem. It can also mean being fully aware, as in, he was lucid after waking from the surgery. Now, let's bring in stoic. A stoic person endures pain or hardship without showing emotions. For example, despite the difficulties, she remained stoic and calm. This word comes from philosophy and describes strength in the face of challenges. Another brilliant one is pragmatic. Pragmatic means dealing with things in a realistic and practical way rather than with theories. For example, her pragmatic approach solved the problem quickly. It's often used in business, leadership, and education. Here's one you'll love, conundrum. It means a confusing or difficult problem. For example, he faced a conundrum, whether to take the safe job or follow his passion. This word is powerful because it describes challenges that don't have simple answers. Let's practice benevolent. A benevolent person is kind and well-meaning. You can say, the benevolent tea. Iker supported all of her students. It's often used when describing leaders or people who help others. Another word that shines is enigmatic. Enigmatic describes something mysterious or difficult to understand. For example, she gave him an enigmatic smile. You might also hear, the painting is enigmatic, open to many interpretations. Now let's focus on perseverance. Perseverance means continuing to do something despite difficulties or delays. For example, learning a language requires perseverance. This word is very motivating and reminds us that success comes from persistence. Another valuable word is scrupulous. A scrupulous person is extremely careful to do what is right or honest. For example, he was scrupulous in keeping his promises. This word suggests both moral integrity and attention to detail. Next is astute. Astute means having the ability to notice and understand things quickly. For example, she made an astute observation during the meeting. You can also say, he is an astute businessman. Let's add precocious. This describes a child who shows advanced abilities at an unusually early age. For example, the precocious child could read novels at the age of 5. It often carries a sense of admiration. Another impressive word is audacious. Audacious means showing a willingness to take bold risks. For example, it was an audacious plan, but it succeeded. It can also mean disrespectful, depending on tone, like, that was an audacious remark. Let's slow down for equanimity. Equanimity means calmness and composure, especially in difficult situations. For example, she accepted the news with equanimity. This is a very advanced word often used in philosophy and psychology. And finally, let's practice gregarious. A gregarious person is sociable and enjoys being around others. For example, he is gregarious, always surrounded by friends. This word is perfect when describing lively personalities. Take a moment to reflect on the words we've explored so far: ephemeral, ubiquitous, quintessential, serendipity, magnanimous, resilient, meticulous, eloquent, altruistic, tenacious, cathartic, idiosyncrasy, lucid, stoic, pragmatic, conundrum, benevolent, enigmatic, perseverance, scrupulous, astute, precocious, audacious, equanimity, and gregarious. These words already give you the power to speak at a much higher level. Remember, don't just listen. Repeat them, practice them in your own sentences, and allow them to become part of the way you naturally speak. The more you use them, the more confident you will sound. Let's continue exploring more powerful C2 vocabulary words that will enrich your English. The more words you collect, the more shades of meaning you can bring into your speaking and writing. One beautiful word is cogent. Cogent describes an argument or explanation that is strong, logical, and convincing. For example, she presented a cogent argument for changing the policy. This word makes your speech sound sharp and intellectual. Another advanced word is circumspect. This means cautious and unwilling to take risks. For example, he was circumspect about investing his money. It shows careful thought before action. Next, we have esoteric. Esoteric refers to knowledge that is intended for or understood by only a small group of people. For example, the professor's lecture was filled with esoteric details that only experts could follow. This word is often used in academic and intellectual contexts. Let's practice fastidious. A fastidious person is very attentive to accuracy and detail, sometimes almost too much. For example, she is fastidious about cleanliness, making sure every surface shines. Another useful one is fortuitous. Fortuitous means happening by chance, often in a ornate way. For example, it was fortuitous that we met at the airport. This word is elegant and uplifting when describing chance encounters. Now consider loquacious. A loquacious person talks a lot, often in a friendly or lively way. For example, the loquacious guest entertained everyone with endless stories. Here's a poetic word, ethereal. Ethereal describes something extremely delicate and light, almost heavenly. For example, the music had an ethereal quality that moved everyone. Let's add obsequious. This describes someone who is overly eager to please or obey. For example, the obsequious assistant agreed with everything the boss said. It often carries a negative tone. Another advanced word is paradoxical. This describes something that seems contradictory but might still be true. For example, it is paradoxical that silence can sometimes speak louder than words. Next comes perfunctory. A perfunctory action is done quickly and without much thought or effort. For example, he gave a perfunctory nod and left. Now, let's learn prolific. Prolific describes someone or something that produces a lot. For example, she is a prolific writer, publishing several books each year. Another word is ravenous. Ravenous means extremely hungry. For example, after the long hike, they were ravenous. It can also mean extremely eager, as in, she had a ravenous curiosity for knowledge. Let's explore sagacious. This means wise and having good judgment. For example, the sagacious leader guided the community through difficult times. Another elegant word is sycophant. This describes a person who flatters someone important in order to gain advantage. For example, the office was full of sycophants trying to please the manager. Now let's practice vindicate. Vindicate means to clear someone of blame or suspicion. For example, the evidence helped vindicate the wrongly accused man. Another advanced word is zenith. Zenith is the highest point or peak of something. For example, at the zenith of her career, she was admired worldwide. And its opposite is nadir. Nadir means the lowest point. For example, the team's confidence hit its nadir after several defeats. Let's add capricious. Capricious describes someone or something that changes suddenly and unpredictably. For example, the weather here is capricious, sunny one moment and stormy the next. Another one is deleterious. This means causing harm or damage. For example, smoking has deleterious effects on health. Now we have ebullient. Ebullient describes someone who is cheerful and full of energy. For example, she was ebullient after receiving the good news. Next is equivocal. Equivocal means unclear or ambiguous, often because someone wants to hide the truth. For example, his equivocal answer made everyone suspicious. Another important word is flummoxed. It means confused and bewildered. For example, the strange question left him flummoxed. Here's a strong one. Impeccable. Impeccable means flawless or without mistakes. For example, her English pronunciation is impeccable. Now, let's practice ineffable. Ineffable describes something so great or extreme that words cannot express it. For example, the beauty of the sunset was ineffable. Another poetic one is ineluctable. This means unavoidable. For example, death is an ineluctable part of life. Next is intransigent. An intransigent person refuses to change their views. For example, the two sides remained intransigent during the negotiations. Here's juxtapose. To juxtapose means to place two things side by side for comparison. For example, the artist juxtaposed light and darkness in her painting. Another valuable word is laconic. Laconic means using very few words. For example, his laconic reply was simply no. Now let's add munificent. This means very generous. For example, the munificent gift surprised everyone. Here's nefarious. It describes something wicked or criminal. For example, the villain's nefarious plan was discovered. Let's practice oblivion. Oblivion means the state of being forgotten or unaware. For example, the old movie sank into oblivion. Another elegant word is onerous. Onerous describes a task that is very heavy or difficult to carry out. For example, the job was onerous but necessary. Now, listen to ostentatious. This means showy, designed to attract attention. For example, the millionaire wore an ostentatious diamond ring. Here's panacea. A panacea is a solution or remedy for all problems. For example, there is no panacea for global issues. Let's add pellucid. Pellucid means very clear, like water or writing. For example, the explanation was pellucid and easy to follow. Another advanced word is penchant. This means a strong liking for something. For example, he has a penchant for classical music. Now, let's try phlegmatic. A phlegmatic person remains calm and unemotional. For example, even during the crisis, he stayed phlegmatic. Here's pithy. Pithy describes language that is short but full of meaning. For example, she gave a pithy comment that ended the debate. Another word is placate. To placate means to calm someone down or make them less angry. For example, the manager tried to placate the unhappy customer. Now let's learn prosaic. Prosaic means dull, ordinary, or lacking imagination. For example, the report was accurate but prosaic. Another beautiful one is redolent. Redolent means strongly reminding of something, often through smell. For example, the kitchen was redolent of spices. Next comes sanguine. Sanguine means optimistic or hopeful, even in a difficult situation. For example, she remained sanguine about the future. Another strong word is soliloquy. This describes a speech in which a character talks to themselves, often in drama. For example, Hamlet's famous soliloquy begins with "to be" or "not to be." Let's practice superfluous. Superfluous means unnecessary or more than enough. For example, the extra details were superfluous. And here's taciturn. A taciturn person is reserved and says little. For example, he was taciturn at the party, speaking only when asked. Finally, in this section, let's try transient. Transient means temporary or passing. For example, the town has many transient visitors. Take a breath and think about how rich your English already sounds with these words: cogent, circumspect, esoteric, fastidious, fortuitous, loquacious, ethereal, obsequious, paradoxical, perfunctory, prolific, ravenous, sagacious, sycophant, vindicate, zenith, nadir, capricious, deleterious, ebullient, equivocal, flummoxed, impeccable, ineffable, ineluctable, intransigent, juxtapose, laconic, munificent, nefarious, oblivion, onerous, ostentatious, panacea, pellucid, penchant, phlegmatic, pithy, placate, prosaic, redolent, sanguine, soliloquy, superfluous, taciturn, and transient. Keep practicing by saying them out loud, and whenever possible, use them in real conversations. With each repetition, your fluency and confidence grow stronger. Let's continue building your advanced vocabulary step by step. The more words you hear and repeat, the more natural they will feel when you want to use them in real conversations. One excellent word is trenchant. Trenchant means sharp, clear, and forceful in expression. For example, she offered a trenchant analysis of the issue. It shows directness and strength in communication. Next we have ubiquity, similar to ubiquitous, but this noun form emphasizes the state of being everywhere at once. For example, the ubiquity of social media has changed communication. Another advanced word is venerable. Venerable describes someone or something that commands respect because of age, wisdom, or character. For example, the venerable professor inspired generations of students. Here's voracious. A voracious person has an eager appetite, usually for food or knowledge. For example, he is a voracious reader, finishing several books a week. Let's practice aberration. Aberration means something that is unusual or not normal. For example, the sudden drop in temperature was an aberration for the season. Another important word is acquiesce. To acquiesce means to accept something reluctantly, but without protest. For example, she acquiesced to her friend's decision. Now let's add admonish. This means to warn or reprimand someone gently. For example, the teacher admonished the students for being late. Another valuable one is antediluvian. This describes something very old or outdated. For example, his views on gender roles are antediluvian. Let's pause with aplomb. Aplomb means confidence and self-assurance. For example, she handled the interview with aplomb. Next comes avarice. Avarice is an extreme greed for wealth. For example, the businessman's avarice led to his downfall. Another poetic one is bellicose. This means demonstrating aggression and willingness to fight. For example, the bellicose tone of his speech alarmed the audience. Now, let's learn bombastic. Bombastic describes language that sounds impressive but has little meaning. For example, the politician's bombastic speech impressed no one. Here's cajole. To cajole means to persuade someone with flattery. For example, he cajoled his friend into joining the trip. Another advanced word is cacophony. This means a harsh, discordant mixture of sounds. For example, the traffic created a cacophony of horns. Let's practice candor. Candor means honesty and openness. For example, I appreciate her candor in admitting the mistake. Next is chicanery. This means the use of trickery to achieve a purpose. For example, the politician was accused of chicanery during the campaign. Now, let's add clandestine. This means kept secret or done secretly. For example, they held a clandestine meeting late at night. Another useful word is coerce. To coerce means to persuade someone using force or threats. For example, he was coerced into signing the contract. Here's complacent. Complacent describes someone who is overly satisfied and not aware of potential danger. For example, the team grew complacent after their early success. Now let's practice conflagration. A conflagration is a large and destructive fire. For example, the forest was destroyed by a massive conflagration. Another powerful word is contrite. Contrite describes someone who feels deeply sorry for wrongdoing. For example, she was contrite after breaking her promise. Let's add convivial. Convivial describes an atmosphere that is friendly and enjoyable. For example, the dinner party was warm and convivial. Next is corroborate. To corroborate means to confirm or support something with evidence. For example, the witness corroborated his story. Here's credulous. A credulous person is too ready to believe things. For example, the credulous tourist believed every story the guide told. Another elegant one is cryptic. Cryptic means mysterious or difficult to understand. For example, she gave a cryptic answer that puzzled everyone. Let's practice cursory. Cursory describes something done quickly and without detail. For example, he gave the report a cursory glance. Another useful word is deleterious. We practiced it earlier, but let's reinforce it here. It means harmful. For example, the policy had deleterious effects on small businesses. Now let's try diatribe. A diatribe is a long and angry speech criticizing someone or something. For example, he launched into a diatribe against corruption. Next is dichotomy. This describes a division or contrast between two things that are very different. For example, there is a clear dichotomy between theory and practice. Another advanced one is disparate. Disparate means fundamentally different or distinct. For example, the two cultures had disparate traditions. Let's add dissonance. Dissonance describes a lack of harmony between sounds or ideas. For example, there was a dissonance between his words and actions. Here's dogmatic. Dogmatic describes someone who strongly insists their beliefs are correct. For example, the dogmatic leader refused to listen to other opinions. Now let's practice duplicity. This means deceitfulness or dishonesty. For example, the spy lived a life of duplicity. Another useful one is ebullience. This is the noun form of ebullient and means cheerful energy. For example, her ebullience lit up the room. Let's add eclectic. Eclectic describes something made from a wide range of sources. For example, her music taste is eclectic, ranging from jazz to electronic. Here's egregious. Egregious means outstandingly bad. For example, The report contained an egregious error. Next is elucidate. To elucidate means to make something clear. For example, the professor elucidated the theory with examples. Another advanced one is embellish. To embellish means to make something more attractive by adding details. For example, she embellished the story to make it more exciting. Let's practice enervate. This means to weaken or drain energy. For example, the hot sun enervated the athletes. Another powerful word is ennui. Ennui describes a feeling of boredom or dissatisfaction. For example, he was filled with ennui after months of routine. Now let's learn entreat. To entreat means to beg or plead sincerely. For example, she entreated him to stay. Another valuable one is epitome. Epitome means the perfect example of something. For example, she is the epitome of kindness. Here's equivocate. To equivocate means to use vague language to avoid telling the truth. For example, he equivocated when asked about the scandal. Now let's add erudite. An erudite person is deeply knowledgeable. For example, the erudite scholar impressed the audience. Another elegant one is espouse. To espouse means to adopt or support an idea. For example, she espoused the cause of equal education. Finally, in this section, let's practice euphemism. A euphemism is a mild or indirect word used instead of one considered too harsh. For example, saying passed away instead of died is a euphemism. Take a moment to let these words settle in your mind. Trenchant, ubiquity, venerable, voracious, aberration, acquiesce, admonish, antediluvian, aplomb, avarice, bellicose, bombastic, cajole, cacophony, candor, chicanery, clandestine, coerce, complacent, conflagration, contrite, convivial, corroborate, credulous, cryptic, cursory, deleterious, diatribe, dichotomy, disparate, dissonance, dogmatic, duplicity, ebullience, eclectic, egregious, elucidate, embellish, enervate, ennui, entreat, epitome, equivocate, erudite, espouse, and euphemism. If you're enjoying this lesson, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more daily English practice. This way, you'll never miss another chance to grow your fluency and confidence. Let's continue deepening your advanced vocabulary journey. Each new word you practice becomes another tool for expressing yourself with precision and elegance. One powerful word is exacerbate. To exacerbate means to make a problem or situation worse. For example, his rude comments only exacerbated the conflict. Next, we have exculpate. This means to show that someone is not guilty of wrongdoing. For example, the lawyer presented evidence to exculpate her client. Another advanced word is exigent. Exigent describes something urgent or demanding immediate attention. For example, the exigent circumstances required quick action. Let's practice fallacious. Fallacious means based on a false idea or mistaken belief. For example, the argument was fallacious and misleading. Here's fatuous. Fatuous describes something silly and pointless. For example, the comedian's fatuous remarks annoyed the audience. Another elegant word is fervent. Fervent means showing strong passion or intensity. For example, she gave a fervent speech about equality. Now let's add fetter. As a verb, it means to restrict or restrain. For example, he felt fettered by tradition. Another important one is flagrant. Flagrant describes something obviously offensive or wrong. For example, it was a flagrant violation of the rules. Here's fractious. This describes someone who is irritable and hard to control. For example, the fractious child refused to sit still. Let's practice garrulous. Garrulous means excessively talkative. For example, the garrulous neighbor talked for hours. Next comes grandiloquent. This describes speech that is pompous and full of long, complicated words. For example, his grandiloquent style impressed few people. Here's hapless. Hapless describes someone who is unlucky. For example, the hapless traveler missed his flight again. Now let's add harangue. A harangue is a long and aggressive speech. For example, the activist delivered a passionate harangue. Another valuable word is hedonistic. This describes someone devoted to seeking pleasure. For example, his hedonistic lifestyle led to problems. Let's practice hubris. Hubris means excessive pride or arrogance. For example, the king's hubris caused his downfall. Another advanced word is ignominious. This means deserving or causing public shame. For example, the scandal led to his ignominious resignation. Now let's learn implacable. Implacable means impossible to calm or satisfy. For example, she was implacable in her anger. Here's impugn. To impugn means to question the truth or validity of something. For example, he impugned her honesty during the debate. Next comes inanity. Inanity means something silly or meaningless. For example, they laughed at the inanity of the TV show. Let's practice inchoate. This means just begun and not yet fully formed. For example, his inchoate idea needed more development. Another one is indefatigable. This describes someone who never seems to get tired. For example, her indefatigable spirit inspired everyone. Here's indolent. Indolent means lazy or avoiding effort. For example, he lived an indolent lifestyle. Now let's add inept. Inept describes someone who lacks skill. For example, the inept driver caused a traffic jam. Another advanced word is ingratiate. To ingratiate means to try to gain favor by flattering. For example, he tried to ingratiate himself with the teacher. Here's inimical. Inimical means harmful or unfriendly. For example, the policy was inimical to progress. Let's practice insidious. Insidious describes something that spreads gradually and is harmful. For example, the insidious disease spread quietly. Another useful word is insolent. Insolent means rude or disrespectful. For example, the student was punished for insolent behavior. Now let's add intrepid. Intrepid means fearless and adventurous. For example, the intrepid explorer climbed the highest mountain. Here's inveterate. Inveterate means firmly established, often in a negative way. For example, he is an inveterate gambler. Next is irascible. This describes someone who gets angry easily. For example, the irascible coach shouted at the players. Another elegant word is jocular. Jocular means humorous and playful. For example, his jocular mood lightened the meeting. Let's add jovial. Jovial also means cheerful and friendly. For example, she had a jovial personality that everyone loved. Here's judicious. Judicious means showing good judgment. For example, her judicious decision saved the project. Now let's practice lament. As a verb, it means to express grief or sorrow. For example, she lamented the loss of her childhood home. Another advanced word is languid. Languid means slow, relaxed, or lacking energy. For example, he moved with a languid grace. Here's largesse. This means generosity in giving money or gifts. For example, the charity depended on the largesse of donors. Next is licentious. This describes behavior that is immoral or unrestrained. For example, the novel was criticized for its licentious themes. Let's add lugubrious. This means looking or sounding sad and gloomy. For example, his lugubrious expression worried his friends. Another powerful word is Machiavellian. This describes someone who is cunning and unscrupulous in politics. For example, the Machiavellian leader manipulated everyone. Here's maelstrom. A maelstrom is a powerful whirlpool or a situation full of confusion. For example, the city was caught in a maelstrom of protests. Now let's add malaise. Malaise means a general feeling of discomfort or unease. For example, there was a malaise in the office after the layoffs. Another advanced one is malevolent. This means having or showing a desire to harm others. For example, the villain had a malevolent smile. Let's practice malign. To malign means to speak about someone in a harmful way. For example, she was maligned in the press. Here's mendacious. Mendacious means dishonest or lying. For example, the mendacious statement misled the public. Next is mercenary. As a noun, it means a soldier hired to fight for money, but as an adjective, it means motivated by money rather than morals. For example, his mercenary attitude disappointed his friends. Another elegant word is mercurial. Mercurial describes someone whose mood changes suddenly. For example, her mercurial temperament made her unpredictable. Now let's add mitigate. To mitigate means to make something less severe. For example, the new policy helped mitigate the risks. Here's morose. Morose means sullen and gloomy. For example, he became morose after the failure. Finally, in this section, let's practice myopic. Myopic means short-sighted, either literally or in thinking. For example, The company's myopic strategy ignored long-term goals. Take a moment to let these words echo in your mind. Exacerbate, exculpate, exigent, fallacious, fatuous, fervent, fetter, flagrant, fractious, garrulous, grandiloquent, hapless, harangue, hedonistic, hubris, ignominious, implacable, impugn, inanity, inchoate, indefatigable, indolent, inept, ingratiate, inimical, insidious, insolent, intrepid, inveterate, irascible, jocular, jovial, judicious, lament, languid, largesse, licentious, lugubrious, Machiavellian, maelstrom, malaise, malevolent, malign, mendacious, mercenary, mercurial, mitigate, morose, and myopic. The rhythm of these words, when practiced aloud, will begin to shape your natural fluency. Keep repeating, keep listening, and soon these will no longer feel like advanced vocabulary, but part of your everyday English. Let's keep moving forward with more advanced vocabulary. Each of these words will help you refine your English, making your speech sound polished, intellectual, and confident. One excellent word is neophyte. A neophyte is a beginner or someone who is new to a subject. For example, as a neophyte in programming, she asked many questions. Next, we have nonchalant. Nonchalant describes someone who appears calm and relaxed, not showing anxiety. For example, he walked into the room in a nonchalant manner, as if nothing had happened. Another advanced word is obdurate. Obdurate means stubbornly refusing to change one's opinion. For example, the committee remained obdurate despite public criticism. Here's obfuscate. To obfuscate means to make something unclear or confusing. For example, the report was written in a way that obfuscated the real issue. Now, let's add odious. Odious means extremely unpleasant or disgusting. For example, the odor was so odious that everyone left the room. Another elegant word is onerous. We saw this earlier, but let's reinforce it. Onerous means a duty that is burdensome or heavy. For example, the task was long and onerous. Here's opulent. Opulent describes something very luxurious and rich. For example, the palace was filled with opulent decorations. Let's practice ostensible. Ostensible means something that appears true, but might not be. For example, his ostensible reason for being late was traffic, but he had actually overslept. Another word is ostracize. To ostracize means to exclude someone from a group. For example, she was ostracized by her classmates for being different. Here's pariah. A pariah is a social outcast. For example, after the scandal, he became a pariah in his community. Next is parsimonious. This describes someone very unwilling to spend money. For example, the parsimonious man refused to buy new clothes. Another strong word is pedantic. Pedantic describes someone too focused on small details or rules. For example, the pedantic teacher corrected every tiny mistake. Now let's add pejorative. A pejorative word expresses disapproval or insult. For example, the term was pejorative and offensive. Here's perfidious. Perfidious means deceitful and untrustworthy. For example, the perfidious ally betrayed them in the end. Next comes pernicious. Pernicious means harmful in a gradual or subtle way. For example, the pernicious influence of fake news spreads quickly. Let's practice pertinent. Pertinent means relevant or directly related to the matter at hand. For example, she asked a pertinent question during the meeting. Another useful one is petulant. Petulant describes someone bad-tempered or childish. For example, the child was petulant after being denied candy. Here's Philistine. A Philistine is a person who is indifferent to culture and the arts. For example, he was called a Philistine for dismissing classical music. Now let's add polemical. This describes writing or speech that is strongly critical or argumentative. For example, the article was polemical in tone. Another elegant word is pragmatism. This refers to a practical approach to problems. For example, her pragmatism helped solve the crisis. Here's precipitous. Precipitous means dangerously steep or happening suddenly. For example, they climbed a precipitous mountain path, or the company faced a precipitous decline in sales. Let's practice prevaricate. To prevaricate means to avoid telling the truth by not giving a direct answer. For example, he prevaricated when asked about the project. Another powerful one is proclivity. Proclivity means a natural tendency or inclination. For example, she has a proclivity for learning languages. Here's propitious. This describes something favorable or likely to lead to success. For example, the weather was propitious for the outdoor event. Now let's add punitive. Punitive means intended as punishment. For example, the government imposed punitive measures on tax evaders. Another advanced word is quandary. Quandary is a state of uncertainty or confusion about what to do. For example, he was in a quandary about whether to accept the offer. Here's quotidian. Quotidian means something that happens every day or ordinary. For example, she described her quotidian routine in detail. Next comes raucous. Raucous means loud and harsh. For example, the crowd gave a raucous cheer. Let's practice recalcitrant. Recalcitrant describes someone who resists authority or control. For example, the recalcitrant student refused to follow the rules. Another strong word is recondite. This means difficult to understand, dealing with obscure knowledge. For example, the lecture was filled with recondite information. Here's remonstrate. To remonstrate means to argue forcefully against something. For example, they remonstrated with the manager about unfair policies. Now let's add reprehensible. This means deserving of criticism or blame. For example, the judge called his behavior reprehensible. Another elegant word is rescind. To rescind means to cancel or repeal something. For example, the company decided to rescind the job offer. Here's reticent. Reticent means reserved, not willing to share thoughts easily. For example, She was reticent about her personal life. Let's practice ribald. Ribald means referring to sexual matters in a rude but amusing way. For example, the play was full of ribald jokes. Another word is sardonic. Sardonic means mocking or sarcastic in a grim way. For example, he gave her a sardonic smile. Here's scathing. Scathing describes harsh criticism. For example, the critic wrote a scathing review of the film. Now let's add scintillating. Scintillating means brilliantly clever or amusing. For example, she gave a scintillating performance. Another advanced one is servile. Servile means too eager to serve or please others. For example, his servile behavior annoyed his colleagues. Here's soporific. Soporific means something that makes you sleepy. For example, the lecture was so soporific that students dozed off. Let's practice spurious. Spurious means false or not genuine. For example, the document contained spurious information. Another useful word is stentorian. This describes a very loud and powerful voice. For example, the teacher's stentorian voice filled the hall. Here's strident. Strident means loud, harsh, and unpleasant. For example, the strident tone of the debate was exhausting. Now let's add subversive. Subversive describes actions intended to undermine authority. For example, the group spread subversive ideas. Another elegant one is surreptitious. This means kept secret, especially because it would not be approved of. For example, they exchanged surreptitious glances. Here's tantamount. Tantamount means equal to something in effect. For example, his silence was tantamount to an admission of guilt. Next is temerity. Temerity means excessive boldness or recklessness. For example, he had the temerity to question the judge. Let's practice timorous. Timorous means showing fear or lack of confidence. For example, the timorous child hid behind his mother. Another powerful word is torpid. Torpid means sluggish or inactive. For example, the heat left him feeling torpid. Here's trenchant again. Reinforce it in your memory. It means sharp and forceful. For example, her trenchant remarks ended the argument. Now let's add truculent. Truculent means eager to fight or argue. For example, the truculent player was ejected from the game. Finally, in this section, let's practice turbid. Turbid describes a liquid that is cloudy or opaque, but it can also mean confused. For example, the river water was turbid after the storm. Take a moment to reflect on these: neophyte, nonchalant, obdurate, obfuscate, odious, onerous, opulent, ostensible, ostracize, pariah, parsimonious, pedantic, pejorative, perfidious, pernicious, pertinent, petulant, philistine, polemical, pragmatism, precipitous, prevaricate, proclivity, propitious, punitive, quandary, quotidian, raucous, recalcitrant, recondite, remonstrate, reprehensible, rescind, reticent, ribald, sardonic, scathing, scintillating, servile, soporific, spurious, stentorian, strident, subversive, surreptitious, tantamount, temerity, timorous, torpid, trenchant, truculent, and turbid. Read them aloud, repeat them in your own sentences, and feel how each one sharpens your English. Every repetition is another step toward mastering C2 level fluency. Let's keep pushing forward with even more advanced words. At this stage, you're collecting vocabulary that allows you to communicate with subtlety, precision, and real elegance. One excellent word is turgid. Turgid describes language that is swollen or overly complicated. For example, his essay was full of turgid prose that confused readers. Next is ubiquitousness. This is another form of ubiquitous, focusing on the state of being everywhere. For example, the ubiquitousness of advertisements can feel overwhelming. Another advanced one is umbrage. To take umbrage means to feel offended or annoyed. For example, she took umbrage at his careless remark. Here's unctuous. Unctuous describes someone who is insincerely flattering. For example, his unctuous smile made everyone suspicious. Let's practice upbraid. To upbraid means to scold or criticize. For example, the teacher upbraided the students for their carelessness. Another strong word is usurp. To usurp means to take power or position by force. For example, the gene, Ral tried to usurp the throne. Here's vacillate. To vacillate means to be indecisive, to keep changing between options. For example, she vacillated between studying medicine and law. Now let's add vacuous. Vacuous describes something empty of meaning or intelligence. For example, the interview was full of vacuous statements. Another advanced word is vehement. Vehement means showing strong feeling or intensity. For example, he gave a vehement denial of the accusation. Here's veracity. Veracity means truthfulness. For example, the journalist's veracity was never questioned. Next comes verbose. Verbose means using more words than necessary. For example, his verbose explanation bored the audience. Let's practice vicarious. Vicarious describes experiencing something through another person. For example, she felt vicarious joy watching her daughter succeed. Another useful word is vicissitude. This means a change of circumstances, often unpleasant. For example, he endured the vicissitudes of fortune with grace. Here's vilify. To vilify means to speak about someone in a harsh and unfair way. For example, the newspaper vilified the politician. Now, let's add vindictive. Vindictive describes someone who seeks revenge. For example, her vindictive behavior shocked her friends. Another elegant word is virulent. Virulent describes something extremely harmful or hostile. For example, the virulent disease spread quickly. Here's visceral. Visceral describes feelings that come from deep inside, instinctive rather than logical. For example, she had a visceral reaction to the news. Next is vitriolic. Vitriolic means filled with bitter criticism. For example, the debate was full of vitriolic comments. Let's practice vociferous. This describes someone loud and forceful in expressing opinions. For example, the crowd was vociferous in their demands. Another advanced one is voluble. Voluble means speaking quickly and easily, often at length. For example, the voluble host entertained the audience. Here's voracity. Voracity refers to an eager hunger or desire, often for knowledge. For example, her voracity for learning never ended. Now let's add wanton. Wanton describes something reckless or cruel. For example, the soldiers were accused of wanton destruction. Another strong word is wistful. Wistful describes a feeling of vague sadness mixed with longing. For example, she gave a wistful smile as she remembered the past. Here's zealous. Zealous means having great enthusiasm or passion for something. For example, the zealous supporter never missed a game. Let's continue with zenithal. Zenithal means related to the highest point, like the sun being directly overhead. For example, at noon, the sun was in its zenithal position. Another advanced word is abstruse. Abstruse describes something difficult to understand. For example, the theory was abstruse and required careful study. Here's acrimonious. Acrimonious means bitter and angry, often used to describe arguments. For example, the divorce ended in an acrimonious dispute. Now, let's add adroit. Adroit means skillful and clever. For example, she is adroit at solving problems. Another elegant word is alacrity. Alacrity means eagerness and cheerful readiness. For example, she accepted the invitation with alacrity. Here's anathema. Anathema describes something strongly disliked or hated. For example, violence is anathema to her beliefs. Next comes anomaly. An anomaly is something that deviates from the norm. For example, the warm winter was an anomaly. Let's practice apathy. Apathy means lack of interest, emotion. For example, the student's apathy concerned the teacher. Another strong word is arbitrary. Arbitrary means based on random choice rather than reason. For example, the rules seemed arbitrary and unfair. Here's arcane. Arcane means understood by only a few, mysterious. For example, the old text contained arcane symbols. Now let's add arduous. Arduous describes something difficult and tiring. For example, climbing the mountain was an arduous task. Another advanced word is assiduous. Assiduous means showing great care and perseverance. For example, she worked with assiduous attention to detail. Here's atrophy. Atrophy means to waste away, often referring to muscles or skills. For example, without practice, his language skills began to atrophy. Next comes avaricious. Avaricious describes someone greedy for wealth. For example, the avaricious landlord raised rents unfairly. Let's practice banal. Banal means boring, lacking originality. For example, his speech was full of banal clichés. Another useful one is beleaguered. This describes someone under constant pressure. For example, the beleaguered manager struggled with endless tasks. Here's boorish. Boorish means rude and insensitive. For example, his boorish behavior ruined the dinner. Now let's add brusque. Brusque means abrupt in manner or speech. For example, her brusque reply ended the conversation. Another advanced word is callous. Callous means showing no concern for others' feelings. For example, he was callous about the suffering around him. Here's catharsis. Catharsis describes emotional release. For example, crying can bring catharsis after stress. Next comes cogitate. To cogitate means to think deeply. For example, he sat silently, cogitating on the decision. Let's practice commensurate. Commensurate means in proportion to something. For example, her salary was commensurate with her experience. Another powerful one is confluent. Confluent means flowing together. For example, the confluent rivers created a wide delta. Here's conspicuous. Conspicuous means easily seen or noticed. For example, her bright red coat was conspicuous in the crowd. Now let's add contemptuous. This describes showing deep dislike or disrespect. For example, he gave a contemptuous glance at his rival. Another elegant one is contentious. Contentious describes something likely to cause an argument. For example, the policy was a contentious issue. Here's conviviality. Conviviality means friendliness and liveliness. For example, the party was filled with conviviality. Next is credence. Credence means belief or acceptance. For example, the story gained credence after more evidence appeared. Let's practice cumbersome. Cumbersome describes something heavy, large, or hard to manage. For example, the cumbersome package was hard to carry. Another strong word is deference. Deference means respectful submission to someone else's opinion or authority. For example, he bowed in deference to the Queen. Here's demagogue. A demagogue is a political leader who seeks support by appealing to emotions rather than reason. For example, the demagogue stirred the crowd with fiery speeches. Finally, in this section, let's practice delineate. To delineate means to describe something precisely. For example, the map delineates the country's borders clearly. Repeat them slowly. Let them roll off your tongue. The more you use them in examples of your own, the more natural they will become. We've reached the final stretch of our journey through powerful C2 vocabulary. Stay with me until the end, because these last words will complete your advanced toolkit and give you everything you need to sound natural, articulate, and highly fluent. One excellent word is denigrate. To denigrate means to criticize unfairly or belittle. For example, he denigrated her achievements out of jealousy. Next, we have deride. To deride means to mock or ridicule. For example, the critics derided the film as shallow. Another strong word is despot. A despot is a ruler who holds absolute power, often in a cruel way. For example, the people rebelled against the despot's rule. Here's didactic. Didactic describes something intended to teach, often in a moralizing way. For example, the novel was entertaining but also didactic. Now let's add diminutive. Diminutive means very small. For example, she lived in a diminutive cottage. Another advanced one is disconsolate. This means very unhappy, unable to be comforted. For example, after the loss, he felt disconsolate. Here's disparage. To disparage means to speak about something in a way that shows it has little value. For example, he disparaged their efforts as meaningless. Next is dissident. A dissident is someone who opposes official policy. For example, the dissident was arrested for protesting. Let's practice distraught. Distraught means very upset or agitated. For example, she was distraught after hearing the news. Another useful one is ebullition. This means a sudden outburst of emotion. For example, his angry ebullition shocked the group. Here's effervescent. Effervescent describes someone lively, enthusiastic, and full of energy. For example, her effervescent personality brightened the room. Now let's add efficacious. This means effective, producing the desired result. For example, the new medicine proved efficacious. Another strong word is egotistical. This describes someone excessively self-centered. For example, his egotistical behavior alienated his friends. Here's empirical. Empirical describes knowledge based on observation or experience rather than theory. For example, the scientist relied on empirical evidence. Next comes encomium. An encomium is high praise or tribute. For example, the retiring professor received an encomium from her colleagues. Let's practice enigmatic once again, just to reinforce it. It means mysterious and puzzling. For example, the enigmatic smile fascinated viewers. Another advanced one is ephemeral, which you practiced earlier, short-lived. Repetition helps lock it in. Here's epistolary. Epistolary describes something related to letters or letter writing. For example, the novel was written in an epistolary form. Now let's add equanimous. Equanimous means showing calmness and balance under stress. For example, he remained equanimous despite the pressure. Another strong word is erratic. Erratic describes behavior that is unpredictable. For example, his erratic driving scared everyone. Here's eschew. To eschew means to deliberately avoid something. For example, she eschewed junk food to stay healthy. Next is euphoria. Euphoria means a feeling of great happiness. For example, she was in a state of euphoria after the success. Let's practice execrable. This means extremely bad or unpleasant. For example, the foos. It was execrable and inedible. Another useful one is extemporaneous. This means spoken or done without preparation. For example, he gave an extemporaneous speech. Here's fallibility. Fallibility means the tendency to make mistakes. For example, human fallibility is natural. Now let's add felicitous. This describes something well-chosen or appropriate. For example, her felicitous remarks cheered the group. Another elegant word is flagrant, which we touched earlier. It means obviously offensive. Keep it close in memory. Here's flippant. Flippant means not showing a serious attitude. For example, his flippant comments annoyed the teacher. Next is foible. A foible is a small weakness in someone's character. For example, one of his foibles is always being late. Let's practice fortitude. Fortitude means courage in facing difficulties. For example, she showed great fortitude during the crisis. Another strong word is frivolous. Frivolous describes something not serious or lacking importance. For example, they wasted money on frivolous purchases. Here's furtive. Furtive describes something secretive or stealthy. For example, she cast a furtive glance at the clock. Now let's add gauche. Gauche means socially awkward or clumsy. For example, his gauche behavior embarrassed him at the party. Another advanced one is germane. Germane means relevant to the subject. For example, her comment was germane to the discussion. Here's guile. Guile means sly or cunning intelligence. For example, he used guile to escape punishment. Next comes harrowing. Harrowing means extremely distressing. For example, the survivors told harrowing stories. Let's practice heresy. Heresy means a belief that goes against accept. Opinion. For example, in the past, heresy was punished severely. Another elegant one is heterogeneous. This describes something diverse in content. For example, the class was filled with a heterogeneous mix of students. Here's histrionic. Histrionic means overly dramatic. For example, her histrionic reaction surprised everyone. Now let's add iconoclast. An iconoclast is someone who challenges traditional beliefs. For example, the artist was an iconoclast who rejected old styles. Another strong word is impecunity. This means having little or no money. For example, during his youth, he lived in impecunity. Here's impetuous. Impetuous means acting quickly without thought. For example, his impetuous decision led to problems. Next comes implacability. This describes the state of being impossible to calm. For example, her implacability frightened her enemies. Let's practice improvident. Improvident means not preparing for the future. For example, his improvident spending caused debt. Another advanced one is incendiary. This describes something designed to cause fires or speech meant to incite anger. For example, The incendiary remarks caused outrage. Here's incisive. Incisive means sharp and clear in expression. For example, her incisive analysis impressed everyone. Now, let's add indignant. Indignant means showing anger at unfair treatment. For example, he was indignant at the accusation. Another elegant word is indomitable. Indomitable means impossible to defeat. For example, her indomitable spirit carried her through. Here's ineptitude. Ineptitude means lack of skill. For example, his ineptitude made the task difficult. Next comes inexorable. Inexorable means impossible to stop or prevent. For example, the rise of technology is inexorable. Let's practice. Ingenuous. Ingenuous describes someone innocent and naive. For example, her ingenuous questions made everyone smile. Another strong word is insatiable. Insatiable means impossible to satisfy. For example, he had an insatiable hunger for success. Here's interminable. This means endless or seeming endless. For example, the interminable meeting bored everyone. Now let's add introspective. Introspective means examining one's own thoughts and feelings. For example, she became introspective after the event. Another advanced one is inundate. To inundate means to overwhelm with things or people. For example, the office was inundated with requests. Here's ironic. Ironic describes something that is the opposite of what is expected. For example, it was ironic that the fire station caught fire. Next comes itinerant. Itinerant describes someone who travels from place to place. For example, the itinerant musician performed across the country. Finally, let's end with juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is the act of placing two contrasting things side by side. For example, the film's juxtaposition of comedy and tragedy was powerful. Pause here and let's breathe together. You've now traveled through more than 125 powerful C2 level vocabulary words. Each one has meaning, depth, and rhythm that can transform your English. Remember, fluency is not only about speed, it is about precision, choice, and confidence. These words allow you to say exactly what you mean, in exactly the right way. So keep practicing. Repeat them out loud, write them in your journal, and use them in your daily conversations. With repetition, they will become part of your natural English, and you will be able to express yourself with nuance and sophistication. Thank you so much for staying with me through this full advanced vocabulary practice. You've done an amazing job by listening, shadowing, and building your vocabulary step by step. Keep going. Don't stop here. Every day you practice, your English grows stronger, clearer, and more powerful. And remember, learning a language is a journey. Sometimes it feels long, but with perseverance and consistency, you'll notice real transformation. I'm so proud of the effort you've put into today's lesson. Stay motivated, stay curious, and trust yourself. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss future lessons. I'll see you in the next one.